are here now for the National Roundtable. It'll go for about an hour. It'll go an hour and a half. I'll probably stop at about the hour so we can really do a lot more Q&A with the audience. We've got a great group here. I'm going to let each person introduce themselves. But you know, when I was first talking about, in Denver, we were the first to start sales, but right after us, hot on our heels, was some other jurisdictions. And these are some of the leaders from some of the great jurisdictions that really have a good handle on the way they're regulating marijuana. And I'll sit in the middle. I'm going to be moderating and asking a few questions. But I'll go ahead and take a seat. And Darcy, could you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Darcy Edel by Herd. I am the Business License Section Manager, Management Marijuana Program Coordinator for the City of Las Vegas.
Good morning, my name is Joe Devlin. I'm with the City of Sacramento. I'm the city's Chief of Cannabis Policy and Enforcement. Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Sure, why don't you
So,
how many licenses you have?
We, our entry into cannabis regulation began in 2010 with the adoption of a voter-approved sales tax or gross receipts tax on cannabis businesses. At that time, we had approximately 54 dispensaries and created like a process for them to become permitted. 30 of those made it through the process. We've had 30 dispensaries since that time. We currently have a completed regulatory framework for all of cannabis, and we've begun taking applications and issuing permits for cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution, as well as testing labs in addition to our retail permits. We are currently in the middle of processing approximately 300 different applications.
Darcy again. Okay, so City of Las Vegas, we started taking medical marijuana applications in 2014. The state, by population, allocated a certain number to all the different jurisdictions, so the city was allocated 12 dispensaries. There was no limit on the number of cultivation and production. It took probably 2 years to get them all up and running, but we do have all 12 dispensaries operating and licensed. We had one cultivation facility that ended up having to close down due to our construction, and he was looking for a new location. And then we do have a couple of new cultivation facilities that have started the process again, one production facility and 4 testing labs. Recreational marijuana started in July of last year, and all of our 12 dispensaries have the dual components to that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kat Packer. I'm the Executive Director of the Department of Cannabis Regulation for the City of Los Angeles. The City of Los Angeles has about 4 million people, so approximately maybe even the same size as the state of Colorado in terms of population. The City of Los Angeles just began to license and regulate commercial cannabis activity at the beginning of this year. We had a system and framework that allowed for certain medical operators to have limited immunity from prosecution, so we never actually authorized medical businesses to operate, but certain medical businesses that had paid taxes in past years, maybe had registered, were able to escape prosecution in past years, but we just began to license and regulate both medical and adult use at the beginning of this year. We currently have 169 locations that are authorized to engage in both medical and adult use retail sales. We were giving these businesses the ability to vertically integrate, so these 169 retail operators are also able to cultivate, manufacture, and distribute. We have a phased licensing process, so we've just kind of concluded accepting applications for our second phase of licensing, and that was an intention to bring on the existing retail market supply chain. One of our council members liked to say that the City of Los Angeles had a cannabis immaculate conception issue because we had authorized all of these retail locations but never really quite knew where the cannabis was coming from. What this has meant is that the past 10 months we have really been focused on trying to transition our previously existing market and have not opened up our licensure process for new businesses in the city.
And I'm Brandon Goldner. I'm the program coordinator and supervisor of the City of Portland, Oregon's Cannabis program. And really good to see all of you here. Thrilled to be here, and thank you to Ashley and the City of Denver for hosting. I've been here 3 times now, starting in 2015, which is when our program was created. Oregon voters approved recreational cannabis in 2014. Our program began in 2015. We started licensing medical dispensaries in late 2015. Recreational businesses came online in early 2017. And as of right now, the City of Portland has 300 active licensees. 150 of those are retailers, and then about 50 are wholesalers, 50 are processors, and 50 are producers. That's what it looks like right now.
Well, I'll start with the initial question and toss it over to this side of the table. Darcy and Joe, what were some initial assumptions that you had about what this would look like? What were some of those initial assumptions, and did they prove to be true or not true?
So I think a lot of us were really concerned that we were going to see marijuana, flowing in the streets and people high all the time, and it was just going to be completely chaos. And of course, that isn't really the case. Some of the assumptions we did have also were it was going to be a problem with the odor, and with the cultivation facilities, seeping out into the communities, being too close to neighborhoods. So we put in some really strict land use regulations to try and keep them away from the residents. And in the city, I think it actually worked out pretty good because we kept those guys in like the industrial area, and they weren't anywhere near the neighborhoods. And I know in other parts of Southern Nevada, the odor has been a problem.
When you talk about odor, are you talking about odor from cultivation or odor from public consumption?
Odor from the cultivation facilities, being that it's still not legal to consume in public, it's a misdemeanor. That really hasn't been too bad of a problem, not any more than it was before. And so that was one of the misconceptions, that it was going to be flowing in the streets and you were just going to, crash into it every 5 seconds, but it really hasn't been that.
So following up on that, have the rest of you been surprised or not surprised about the level of public consumption that you're seeing in your streets?
Well, for Sacramento, I don't think we've really seen a big uptick in that. I mean, we've had an element of it, and to begin with, one of my assumptions was that we already had a cannabis industry to a degree. We already had cannabis in our community it never really went away. But we made lots of assumptions around cost, around staff time, around how much time it's going to take to do X, Y, and Z, and we were not accurate, but we were in the ballpark. And so what we've had to do is go back and change a lot of those assumptions. We also made assumptions around impacts. So we began with kind of, I think, the general assumption that this was going to have a lot of negative impacts. And while what we have learned, I think that particularly around like cultivation, there are issues around odor. It's just difficult to contain all of it. And so there are land use decisions become important, and we got some of those more right. We also had some lessons learned that the retail portions of this were not necessarily so land use sensitive that they need to be sequestered off into industrial parts of the cities. Now, we wrote our code that way, but we also grandfathered in our 30 dispensaries, and that allowed us to have an experience that we couldn't have planned for. And so while the rule said you had to be off into these 2 corners of the city, more or less, our dispensaries were essentially spread out across the city, including near schools, including near parks, and included in, quote unquote, nice neighborhoods. And they were not problematic. And so some of those assumptions have, I think, not come to fruition.
So I'd love to hear from you guys. That same public consumption question, are people smoking in the street and high in the street? And also that issue that I think both Joe and Darcy touched on. Were you surprised by the LOE, the level of effort and resources taken to do this, required to do this?
So I think that I would echo what Joe said about the assumptions along infrastructure and timeline and how much staff we would need. When the City of Los Angeles first created a Department of Cannabis Regulation back in 2017, it did so before we had developed rules and regulations. So we had created a team before we knew exactly what the team was going to be responsible for. At the same time, we were waiting for the state of California to develop its regulations. And so when the department was first created, we were created as a department of 5. For the first 4 months, it was just me in the Department of Cannabis Regulation. So folks would be surprised. You'd call the department and I'd answer the phone. And it was kind of difficult to get work done that way because we had a lot of interest in the city of Los Angeles. In terms of staffing, we recognized that we were going to need a lot more positions to do what the rules and regulations actually required us to do. So we went from having 5 positions to 10 months later being allocated for a total of 28 positions. We have 11 of those positions filled, and this is for folks doing licensing and compliance, public outreach and communications, just even tracking the policy. And I think one of the other assumptions I think that I had when we first started was that I assumed that there would be some sense of stability over the course of the first 12 months of this implementation, but we've seen the state of California at this point is still operating under emergency regulations. There have been 4 different iterations of what our commercial framework has looked like. Every single time the state of California changes its framework, we have to reevaluate what our local framework looks like. We'll address the public consumption issue. The city of cannabis is no stranger to the city of Los Angeles. I think what has surprised me the most is that we still have kind of flagrant commercial consumption that I'm starting to see pop up. I was reading an LA Weekly article where they were doing a profile on a Cannabis where folks could tour and kind of hotbox this bus and roll around the city, and I thought that was surprising because that is illegal. But it's being profiled in this widely read magazine, and so there's a lot going on in terms of cannabis activity in the city. There are things that kind of surprise me every single day. I didn't know that kind of dealing with technology platforms and folks that illegally advertise illegal businesses would be such a big issue, but that's been a huge issue. But lots of challenges to deal with in this first 12 to 14 months.
Yeah, plenty of assumptions we made, some of which were accurate, some were not. Mentioned earlier the potential deleterious effects that retailers would have on neighborhoods. That is not something that we have seen. In fact, quite the opposite. From infrastructure improvements to increase pedestrian counts for neighborhoods that really need it can actually be a positive benefit. Another assumption, especially early on, again, I joined the program in 2015 in a different role. I've just been the supervisor for a year now. But assuming that businesses could be prepared to perfectly navigate an imperfect regulatory system, that's tough. And again, all of us at this table, we know that what we've implemented is not perfect. We'll never be perfect, but that we're trying to make it better as time goes on. And that's something I'm going to talk about a lot here, and if you bump into me out in the lobby, is to be adaptive and to change. That's so important, and not to be married to the assumptions you made early on. They may not be true, right? Those assumptions may not end up being accurate. To be able to step back and say, hey, we were wrong about that, we'd like to get it right, that's very, very important to us. And yeah, the concerns about the for-hire buses. In Portland, you can't have a for-hire vehicle where people are either smoking or vaporizing tobacco or cannabis. That is definitely not allowed. And a lot more I could say, but just time, I'll cut it there.
Well, Brandon, Kat mentioned the issue with the state and the laws evolving at the state. And then, for the most part, our laws are based on what's coming out of the state. And when the state's changing so quickly, it's hard for us to keep up. Can you share with us what it's like for you working with the state, and are there some natural tensions there, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, we have a good working relationship with the state of Oregon, but there will be some natural tensions because the state is interested in the entire state. They have to write regulations that apply to an urban environment like Portland as much as they do to a rural environment like Pineville. So the city of Portland, when we're at the table at the Rules Advisory Committee, for example, when OLCC, the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, when they're changing their rules, we want to represent the view of the city of Portland while still being mindful that these rules are meant for the entire state. And it's true that things do change quickly, both at the state and the local level. And one thing I'm not going to talk too much now because there's a panel on it tomorrow, but social consumption, that issue came up during the legislative session in 2017. It's going to come up again in 2019. And those are the kinds of things, building code, fire code requirements, hours of operation, delivery to consumers at their home. I mean, all of these things are regulated at the state level and also impact the city. And then one more natural tension would be, the city of Portland, they want to pursue policies that are explicitly not allowed by the state. So we can't say, hey, you can come to Portland and do something the state doesn't allow. That's not the way it works. And so we have to do our best to make our positions clear and keep those working relationships healthy while providing feedback and being mindful. And again, when the state's making rules at the state level, that's kind of their ballpark, and we'll do our best to give our feedback. But yeah, that's always an interesting give and take.
So how many state regulators do we have in the audience? Okay, so we'll watch our comments a little more carefully.
Thank you for the reminder. I appreciate that.
But I think it really is, it's a challenge for all of us. It's a challenge for you guys to work with us and get your information to us, and us the same. Darcy, I know you had some comments about working with the state.
Yeah, so back in 2014 when we were starting to implement this, we decided we wanted to try and get a good working relationship with our state, and we invited them over, the head of the state of Nevada of the marijuana program at the time, to come and let's have our doors open. Here's our lines of communication. Here's how we're going to deliver information. And we were all on the same page. And then their regulations said one thing, and our regulations, have to try and match that. And when we were trying to get information back, all of a sudden communication stopped. They wanted everything from us, but we weren't getting it back the other way. And I think it had a lot to do with that they didn't think they were allowed to share the information. So I don't blame them for it, but it makes it very difficult for us to do our jobs and make sure that we're all following the same page when we're not having that two-way street. And we did also set up this Southern Nevada local conference call with the state. We would do a monthly call with the regulators from the state, and all of us would come on the phone, and we would, hey, here's what we're seeing, here's the problems that we have, do you have answers for us? And it was always, well, we'll have to get back to you on that. And we would maybe get 50% of our answers. And so we would sort of kind of have to make things up on the fly, trying to make sure we're not breaking any rules, but we needed answers, and things were coming at us so fast. And we just weren't getting the information fast enough. So that was kind of a challenge, but I think the relationship has been better lately.
Well, with Joe and Kat, you're dealing with the same state. What are your tactics for keeping that communication open and getting information?
Well, first, Kat and I also talk on a regular basis along with our counterparts from other cities, and so that's one of the first things that we do. I think overall our relationship with the Bureau of Cannabis Control and the other state agencies as a whole is pretty good. The Bureau Chief, Lori Ajax, has been very accessible to I think myself and others. I think where I see challenges, they're both kind of potentially big and small, but a lot of the day-to-day ones of, hey, we had a state inspector come in and told us X, Y, and Z, and 2 days before that we had a city inspector come by and tell us something different, and they were both pretty close, and well, I think our interpretation of the code is right. I think working all of that out is going to just take a little bit of time.
I'll echo that. It's been extremely helpful to be able to have a group of peers to call on a regular basis. I probably communicate most regularly with Joe in Sacramento, Nicole Elliott, who runs the San Francisco office, and Greg Miner, who's here, who runs the Oakland office. Even just recently, in the last 48 hours, we had a situation come up where I needed to get in touch with all 3 state agencies, send an email out, and we're able to get on the phone with the chiefs of these 3 state agencies. And so I think that that shows a tremendous effort on their end. It hasn't always been that way. We all have our own responsibilities, and sometimes we operate in silos. So to the extent that we are communicating, I think that that's been extremely helpful. There are kind of 2 policy issues that we engage with they're huge issues that we engage with on a regular basis. The regulatory side, and 3 regulatory agencies that have at this point hundreds of pages of regulation that are subject to interpretation. And just as Joe said, we want to assume that our interpretation is the correct interpretation, but they may not always be. And so there needs to be a constant line of communication to understand how these regulations impact our local programs. And then we saw on the legislative side, we saw over 65 bills introduced in the legislature. And so it does take a lot to track all of these different changes that are happening on both the regulatory side and on the legislative side. And every single time these changes happen, we have to reevaluate our program.
This is really a universal issue for all of us here in this room, whether you're with a state or with a city. In Denver now, after 5 years, we're seeing some headway. From the very beginning, Molly and I and a couple of our team members would have monthly lunches with our state representatives, and those were Andrew Freeman and Louis Koski. So we've always had monthly lunches with them. Then we sort of rolled it out to quarterly lunches with the Marijuana Enforcement Division and the Department of Ag, if we had something going on with that. In about our 2nd year, we did a cross-training, inspector cross-training, where we had like every single agency, fire and CPD and excise and license and environmental health. And then we had the state agencies, we had the DAs come in, and we sort of did, I think it was a couple of hours, but we had each inspecting agency say, "Hi, my name is such and such, I work for such and such department. Our mission is this, and here are the top 3 things we're looking for, and here's my phone number." And I think that started where you heard kind of at least the very basics of what people were doing, and you knew that if you saw something, whatever fire might say, "Call me if you see this." People started developing those relationships that could really help each other. So it's been 5 years from us. Oh, and now it's even gotten to where like our licensing techs will go over to the state and spend a half day with the state licensing techs. Our inspectors will go back and forth, and our data people are sharing data better. But it's tough because we're all moving really quickly, and as we said, we're all developing our regulations, and so it's hard to stay aligned. So I think another comment that we all hear about is that we all feel like we've been building the fire truck on the way to the fire, flying the plane while we're building it, all of those types of things. And I know, Joe, you've really in particular felt that. Do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts on that and how you did it?
Thank you. Well, there's just a lot of unknowns, right? I mean, it goes back to kind of like the assumption question, and like we made a whole bunch of assumptions, and I think, many of them proved to be kind of more or less accurate. They certainly weren't accurate enough for, things like accounting and budgets. We thought enforcement was going to cost X and permits were going to be Y, and they would kind of all pay for itself, and that turned out to be mostly true, but not entirely true. So, between the infrastructure that's needed to do this and the budget consequences that go along with that, as well as on the policy side, we've had to remain constantly adaptive. My office was created in 2016. After 6 months of being on the job, I took back a kind of revised staffing model to City Council, and 12 months after that, I'm getting ready to go back to them with potentially another change to that staffing model. We've changed permit structures for some of our manufacturing permits, distribution permits, before we even had a chance to issue them, because we got it wrong. And so I think acknowledging kind of when things aren't going as you thought, and recognizing where you need to change is going to be incredibly valuable to your organization as you move forward with this. Being, again, as flexible, as Brandon said, as flexible and adaptive as you can, and not being married to any particular idea.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I just kind of wanted to echo what Joe said. For us, in 2014, we had this really robust ordinance for the city of Las Vegas, and we thought we had a really great job. We're like, okay, this is how it's going to work. We're going to regulate everything from A to Z. And every step that they take, this is how they're going to take it. And we went through and we thought, yeah, look at us. And some of the other Southern Nevada localities even copied parts of our code. And we're like, yeah, we're the gold standard. And after businesses came in and started operating, slowly they started complaining. They complained to our city council, and they complained to the industry, and they complained to us. And they said, you guys, you're really too strict. Our fees were $75,000 annual for a dispensary every year. Plus, you had to report your gross revenue twice a year, 7% on anything that you sold out of that was a manufactured product, and 5% on a raw product. And so twice a year you pay us those fees. Our cultivation fees were like $20,000 for the first 5,000 square feet of space, and then $10,000 for each additional 5,000. They were really, really high. And right next door, our Clark County was charging like 3% of gross sales, and it was really just this disparity. And so, having to listen to the industry, having to listen to everybody, we have probably revamped our code, I would say probably 10 times since 2014, and we're still not quite there yet. So it has been a learning process, and then of course with legislative session coming in, as Kat was talking about, having to change what you thought was how you wanted to regulate it, and the state saying, no, you can't do that. They actually last year capped our fees and said you can't charge more than 3%. So there goes our $75,000 in our budgets.
Those are real challenges that we faced in Denver too. How have you guys overcome that? Trying to anticipate their specific regulatory needs and come up with the right answer, but still be willing to track and monitor and make changes when you need to.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. And the first is be really clear about the processes by which you can change your rules and regulations. Is it state law? Is it city code? Are they administrative processes? Do your staff have discretion over some of those things? It's important to know before they come up so that you know the ways in which you can change and adapt. That's very important. The second is make sure you're letting reality shape your policies and not the other way around. Again, if you're seeing something on the ground that's not working, I would highly recommend to not kind of go to the ends of the earth to defend it, to be open to understanding why it may not be working and then changing and adapting. And the last thing is especially for jurisdictions who are just getting up and running, I mean, everything is coming at you so unbelievably fast. It is very, very hard to track everything at the same time. You're worried about getting forms, you're getting the website up and running, communications are going out, you're getting a database set up and spreadsheets, all this stuff. That in all of that, don't forget about other issues that are also critically important. And for me, what comes to mind with that is, the populations who are most affected by cannabis prohibition, those populations are not the ones we're seeing benefiting from this new legal regulated industry. And to me, that does not feel right, that does not feel fair. And so don't lose sight of the broader picture of cannabis now being legal and regulated. And for Portland, I mean, we took a small but important step last month passing a social equity program that provides extra assistance to small businesses, to those who contract with minority and women-owned emerging small businesses, and for those who actually have cannabis convictions in their past. And that's something that we should have thought about 3 years ago, not now. And so again, for all of you who are doing this, yes, get the details right, be sure the processes are tight, but also be able to zoom out and look at the broader view is also extremely important.
And I'll just say, there are probably headlines that come out every 2 weeks, or it seems like every week, that suggest that the city of Los Angeles isn't doing things fast enough. And for me, the goal has never been to build a fast plane, but to build one that was going to be sustainable, and we want to be able to do this the right way. And that means taking a couple of steps back and really trying to figure out what you want your either local economy, your local community to look like 10 to 20 years from now. So I'm not very much concerned about the timeline, but what the impact and result of all of our efforts are going to mean. Folks want licenses, and there seems to be an assumption in the industry that there is a licensing fairy, that can poof and you get there is an entire infrastructure that's necessary for you to produce and hand out a license. And for many of the folks who sit on, who are sitting at this table, it's my name that's on that license. And so I want to make sure that before someone gets a license that they've gone through, proper building and fire code inspections, and that we're having a conversation about health and youth prevention. And so I think that part of the biggest challenge has been trying to manage high expectations of the many different stakeholders who are involved in this process, and for local regulators, we're talking about things that are hyper-local. Unlike some of these state agencies, we engage with local neighborhood councils. There are 96 different neighborhood councils in the city of Los Angeles, and there's a lot of NIMBYism when it comes to this industry. And so it's not just the industry, it's not just elected officials, it's not just community members, and it's the whole picture that we're trying to navigate and make progress on.
And I think when I think back on it, the example that I always think, and I might sort of have it a little different, but I remember initially a fire going into a marijuana manufacturer and saying, the story is, you need an X, Y, and Z type hood. And they put that hood in, and we thought they were doing certain type of extractions and a certain level of extractions. And we went back a couple of months later, and they were doing significantly bigger work. Then they needed a X, Y, and Z, really much bigger hood. I think they can use the technical terms a little bit better than I can when they talk to you. But the industry then is mad. I mean, we feel like we know what they're doing, so we say, here's a solution. But then we didn't really know exactly what they were doing. They're doing something bigger. So then it's, well, you need to backtrack, we revise our rules. We do need to remember, every time we change our rules and regulations, the industry is incurring an additional cost. So one thing we've tried to do, it hasn't worked yet, but for the past couple of years, we've told the industry, tell us what you're doing, bring to us what you're doing. If you're developing something new, and even if you want to keep it proprietary, let us know ahead of time so we can walk down that path together with you, and we can talk to our attorneys and see if we can keep it confidential. But let's walk that path together, rather than being in the situation where they're asking for forgiveness and not permission. So I don't have the answer for that. I think it's just continuing to keep the lines of communication open and just be willing to be flexible and nimble.
Can I speak to that briefly?
Yeah.
And I will keep it brief. I think that part of what we can all do, and you're right that as much as we try to be open and available, it's up to folks to come to you. But do make yourself open and available. Meet people where they are. If people want to meet with you, find time on your calendar to do it. Find time on your calendar to make it out to their facility so they're not just coming to your office. Make sure you're answering your voicemails and emails in a timely fashion. Because here's the deal for me, if I'm a resource, if I'm available for somebody, it makes it more likely they're going to come back next time. It's going to make it more likely they can navigate our processes and that they have the information that they need to succeed, and also that they're compliant and that they're safe. So really, in my opinion, going the extra mile to be accessible is extremely important. And again, it won't guarantee that you'll get that cross collaboration, but it'll make it more likely.
Okay, so switching tracks to another issue that we dealt with maybe 5 years ago, and I know some of you are in various processes of dealing with it. I'll start off with Brandon. How did you deal with, or are you still dealing with, businesses that you had up and running that were illegal operations prior to legalization? And what have you done, if anything, to sort of bring them into the regulated market?
Yeah, when our program first started, we began by licensing medical dispensaries, which were differently regulated, I would say, and I think most people would agree that the medical cannabis side, the regulations are a little less strict than on the recreational side, at least that's been the experience in Oregon. So we wanted to make sure that they came into the fold, that folks who were operating for a while had a pathway to get compliant and to get legal. And then, separate from that, we've definitely seen that there have been businesses who were operating either, quasi-legally or not legally, who want to then get licensed and get legal. The tricky balance, and this is true of everything having to do with cannabis, is all balance, but you want to make sure folks are safe, you want to make sure they're following the rules, but also you want to make sure that your structure encourages people to go through that process. And, particularly, one thing I think that there's a breakout panel for this, for fire and building code. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a plans examiner, I'm not an expert. And there are businesses who hire engineers, and they are the experts, but they're not engaging with the city's processes, your local jurisdictions building a fire code. They go, oh, we got it, it's safe, it's fine. That may be true, but the reason why you have those codes in place and those local inspectors is to make sure that that is true. So as much as you can encourage them to get into those processes, the better. But yes, it is very tricky.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
So we had an existing industry before all of our regulations were in place, and I guess what is kind of for me embedded in that question, what was our philosophical approach to dealing with this? And this is one of the reasons why I really like this topic. I mean, you can't sit in too many rooms and talk about federalism and behavioral economics and all on the same topic. But for me, this is really about economics, right? So what we were trying to do is get a whole bunch of people and consumers and get them to purchase through a legal infrastructure. And in order to do that, the market needs to be accessible and the prices need to be competitive. And it was kind of within that philosophy that we decided, rather than shutting down these existing cultivators that were in our city, that some of which had been cultivating in that building for one of them told us 17 years. So he wasn't exactly new to it. We instead said, okay, when we were adopting a framework, we said, okay, raise your hand and tell us that you're doing it. And we created a registration process. We said, okay, we got 150 plus people register. Of those, it turned out about 40 of them were actually cultivating. And so we created a registration process. Now, were those buildings compliant? Absolutely not. Like, for a whole bunch of reasons. Some of them were more compliant in terms of building standards than others. I mean, some of them, it was just a hot mess. But we created a process for them to become legal, and we're still working through that process. We've had some people successfully come out the other end, but our whole approach was to take this existing industry and try and funnel them through and into a legally compliant structure.
So you still have businesses operating that aren't licensed?
They are operating we've allowed them, they've applied for a business operating permit with the city of California as a dual licensing requirement. They've obtained their temporary license from the state. But for us, that local permit is going to be the last thing they get. It's both the carrot and the stick that we're holding over their head. And so in the interim, we said, okay, in addition to your operating permit, you also need to submit building plans and go through all of that process and make sure that your facility meets all the building and fire codes. And after they get their certificate of occupancy, we'll then be issuing a business operations permit.
And so, Kat, I would assume you have that challenge too, with just having passed a Proposition 64 in January. Can you tell us what you're doing with that?
Sure. So our local Measure M, which passed in March of 2017, is what allowed the City of Los Angeles to the first time license, regulate, and tax adult use cannabis. Within our local Measure M, we specifically established that we were going to give priority processing to our existing medical marijuana dispensaries. We have a phased licensing process in general, and the first phase was for our existing medical marijuana dispensaries. That's what we largely refer to as phase one. Our phase 2 is intended to deal with this cannabis immaculate conception issue and to bring in the supply chain, these cultivators and manufacturers who had been previously supplying the retail locations, but it's been a real challenge. There are thousands of unregulated operators in the city of Los Angeles, and I'll pause to make a note. When I go out and communicate, I've been trying to let folks know that similar to how we use the term cannabis instead of marijuana now, I think it's no longer appropriate for us to use the term black market to mean criminal market. If we mean unregulated market, we should use that term, so it's a blanket ask for folks not to use the term black market to mean criminal market. But part of the challenge is that because of the way that the state of California had developed this collective model, anybody could have been an existing supplier to a retail business. I could be growing at home in my garage and I'd go up to a retail shop and say, I've got 10 pounds I'd like to sell you as a part of this collective model. And that's how a lot of these businesses really started. And so we are experiencing real difficulty with trying to, one, just allow folks to know what's happening. I think that sometimes we assume that the industry knows what we're doing and knows what the state of California is doing, but we hold regular meetings and it's almost as if folks were living under a rock and didn't know that, Proposition 64 passed and we have regulations now, and that there is a Department of Cannabis regulation that folks need licensing for. So I think on one hand, we have a large responsibility to educate and let folks know what the process is, but it can be difficult to do so when we're, one, doing the process for the first time and learning the process ourselves. And so to the extent, as Brandon said, that we can be available, we've tried to, but there was one point where we had more email accounts than we had staff, just to kind of deal with the incoming and trying to communicate with community members and have that happen in an organized fashion and communicate with industry folks and applicants and have that operate in an organized fashion. And I think that part of the challenge, the real challenge that folks in the state of California are experiencing right now has to deal with some of the assumptions that folks made back in 2016 and 2015 when these frameworks were first being developed at the state level. For the past year, California state licensing and regulatory agencies have been issuing temporary licenses. And those temporary licenses, these state agencies are going to stop issuing these temporary licenses at the end of the year. And if you don't have a temporary license, you can't get a new type of license called a provisional license. And the bar for the state temporary license is essentially very low. The provisional license is a little bit higher, and the annual license is an even larger hurdle for industry members to get access to. And so what we're experiencing right now, and so Joe may have his own experiences, but our operators are trying to get this state temporary license. And the truth of the matter is that because of the process where folks have to go through our fire department and our Department of Building and Safety, and security plans have to be reviewed, and we're dealing with hundreds of applicants at the same time, some of these folks just aren't going to be able to clear that hurdle before the end of the year. In hindsight, it would have been much nicer if the state temporary license would have extended into 2019. But that's something that we have no control over at this point. And so for jurisdictions, states that have an existing market, assume that that transition time is going to be at least 3 times longer than you would regularly imagine. You're dealing with operators who, for decades, have intentionally tried to avoid any type of government agency. And now they're being asked to deal with 15 different agencies, and any of these 15 different agencies could be the sole reason why they are denied a license. And so it's just a huge effort to try and, one, orchestrate, and then also to articulate to operators.